Before we dive into this story, I need you to do one thing for me. If this story makes you feel something, if it hits you right in the chest and you find yourself whispering "Oh my God" or holding your breath, hit that like button and smash that subscribe button. Because what I'm about to tell you is not just a story. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest moments of your life are also the most life-changing ones. Now sit back, get comfortable, and let me take you somewhere you have never been before. Her name was Clara Morrow, and she had spent the last 4 years believing that she was invisible. Not in the poetic, romantic kind of way people sometimes say it. No. She meant it literally. She walked into rooms full of people and nobody turned. She spoke in meetings and nobody leaned forward. She existed in the margins of everyone else's story, a footnote, a whisper, a name nobody remembered after the door closed. And somewhere along the way, Clara had stopped expecting anything different. She had built a quiet little fortress around her heart, told herself it was strength, told herself she didn't need anyone to see her, and went on with her days like a woman who had already accepted her place in the world. She was 32 years old, and she had already given up. She worked at Langston & Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm in a glass-walled office building downtown, the kind of place where everyone wore pressed shirts and smiled in a way that never quite reached their eyes. Her boss was a man named Elliot Vane. Elliot was the kind of person who filled a room just by walking into it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried authority without ever needing to raise it. He was respected. He was admired. And to Clara, he was the most terrifying human being she had ever worked for, not because he was cruel, but because he was so impossibly aware of everything happening around him. He noticed things. He noticed people. And Clara lived in absolute, paralyzing fear that one day, he would notice her, truly notice her, and find her wanting. The trip to the coast was supposed to be a team-building retreat. That was the official language used in the company email. A weekend getaway to a beachfront property the company had rented, something about bonding and reconnecting and all those hollow corporate words that everyone rolls their eyes at but shows up for anyway, because free food and a weekend away from the office is a weekend away from the office. Clara had almost not gone. She had spent 2 days drafting polite excuses in her head, reasons she could give, emergencies she could fabricate. But in the end, she went, because saying no required a kind of confidence she did not have, and saying yes required nothing at all. The property was stunning. A sprawling beach house with wide wooden decks and salt-worn railings, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The ocean stretched out in front of them, enormous and indifferent, and Clara stood at the edge of the deck that first evening and stared at the water and felt something she could not name. Something close to loneliness, but deeper. Something closer to ache. The first day passed the way these things always do. Awkward icebreaker games that nobody wanted to play. Too much wine at dinner. Conversations that skimmed the surface of everything and the depth of nothing. Clara sat at the end of the long table, laughing when she was supposed to laugh, nodding when she was supposed to nod, and counting the hours until she could retreat to her room and be alone with the sound of the waves. She caught Elliot glancing at her once, across the table, and her stomach dropped, and she looked away so fast she nearly knocked over her glass. It was the second evening when everything shifted. The others had gone inside. The sun was low and heavy, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Clara had stayed behind on the beach because she could not bring herself to go back to the noise and the laughter and the pretending. She was sitting on a stretch of sand with her shoes off and her toes buried in the cool ground, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the waves break and retreat, over and over again, like the ocean was practicing something it could never quite get right. She heard him before she saw him. The quiet crunch of sand under footsteps, unhurried, deliberate. And then Elliot Vane sat down next to her. Not at a polite distance. Not across from her. Next to her. Close. Closer than a boss sits next to an employee. Closer than a colleague sits next to a colleague. His shoulder was inches from hers, and she could feel the warmth of him even through the cooling evening air, and her heart started beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The waves filled the silence. The wind moved through her hair. And then he leaned toward her, just slightly, just enough that his mouth was near her ear, and he whispered 4 words that Clara would spend the rest of her life turning over and over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. Act like you're mine tonight. Her breath caught. Her body went rigid. And for one wild, terrifying second, she thought she had misheard him. But she hadn't. She knew she hadn't, because the words landed somewhere deep inside her chest, in a place she had thought was sealed shut, and they cracked something open. She turned to look at him, slowly, carefully, like turning too fast might break whatever fragile thing had just happened between them. His eyes were already on her. Not the way they were in the office, calm and collected and unreadable. These eyes were searching. Vulnerable. Almost afraid. And Clara realized, with a shock that moved through her like electricity, that Elliot Vane was not making a move on her. He was asking for help. What do you mean? She whispered back, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, barely louder than the tide. And then he told her. Elliot had a daughter. Her name was Sophie. She was 7 years old, and she lived with Elliot's ex-wife most of the time, and she was sick. Not the kind of sick that goes away with medicine and rest. The kind of sick that changes everything. Sophie had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that was slowly, steadily stealing her energy, her ability to move, her ability to be a normal little girl. The doctors had said there were options. Experimental treatments. A specialist overseas. But the treatments were expensive. Devastatingly expensive. The kind of expensive that no salary, no matter how good, can touch. And Elliot was not just trying to save his daughter. He was trying to keep his company from falling apart while he did it. Because 3 days before the retreat, the company's largest investor, a man named Richard Hale, had arrived in town. Richard was wealthy, ruthless, and considering pulling his funding entirely, which would mean layoffs, which would mean dozens of people losing their jobs, people with families of their own, people who depended on this company the way Clara depended on showing up every morning and believing her life had some kind of structure. Richard was coming to a dinner. A private dinner, the following night, at a restaurant in town. And Richard had a reputation. He did not do business with men he did not trust. He did not invest in people who seemed desperate. He needed to see Elliot as stable. Grounded. Happy. And Elliot was none of those things, because his daughter was dying and he was terrified and he had been hiding it from everyone for months, and the cracks were starting to show. I need someone beside me tomorrow night, Elliot said, still looking at the water, his jaw tight, his hands folded in his lap like he was holding himself together. Someone who looks comfortable. Someone who looks like she belongs there. Someone who makes me look like a man who has something worth protecting. He paused. Swallowed. I'm not asking you to pretend to love me, Clara. I'm asking you to pretend to be happy. Just for one night. That's all I need. The silence that followed was enormous. Clara stared at him. At the way the last light of the sun caught the lines around his eyes. At the way his hands trembled, just barely, just enough that she noticed. And she thought about all the years she had spent being invisible. All the years she had spent shrinking, disappearing, making herself as small as possible so nobody would look too closely and see how ordinary she was. And she thought about a little girl named Sophie, somewhere out there in the world, who was running out of time. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." The dinner the next night was at a restaurant called Saltwater, a quiet, candlelit place with white tablecloths and the kind of menu that didn't have prices on it. Clara spent the afternoon in a state of quiet panic. She had nothing to wear. She had no idea how to act. She had never been someone's arm candy, had never been on anyone's arm at all, and the idea of walking into a room next to Elliot Vane and pretending to be something she wasn't made her hands shake every time she thought about it. But then something strange happened. Something she didn't expect. She stopped being afraid. It happened gradually, the way dawn comes, not all at once but in increments, the light changing by degrees until suddenly you realize the dark is gone. She was standing in front of the mirror in her small room at the beach house, wearing a simple navy dress she had found crammed at the back of her suitcase, one she had packed on impulse and never intended to wear, and she looked at her own reflection and she said, out loud, to no one, "You can do this." And for the first time in years, she believed it. When she walked down the stairs, Elliot was waiting at the bottom. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, a